206.
206. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Atlantic Bushcraft Adventures. As we just said, this is episode 206, and we're talking about guylines. And this was one of your suggestions, Ben, so why don't you walk us in? Tell us what we're going to be talking about tonight.
Yeah, I just thought it was something different. I was out last weekend. I think we just happened to be out shopping, and I had put some guidelines on. I think it was my chimney for my stove, and I just wasn't happy with the ones I had picked up. And I started thinking a bit about them, and I said, it's not something that people talk about all the time, but it is. It does have a bigger effect on a lot of my trips than you'd expect. Like, there's some planning going on to guidelines, and if you plan them out right, you set them up right from the beginning, it saves you a lot of work down the road. And you know what I mean, right?
Oh, for sure.
So I thought I'd talk a little bit of what do you look for, what do you not look for, what do you need to do, and there's quite a bit to it. So I thought it was a good subject, and I thought that me and you could easily squeeze our hour out.
For sure. Just saying hi to Chris there, saying hi to us in the comments. Hello, Chris. Chris Jones. I guess the big thing for when it comes to guylines is, or that I wanted to talk about and why I liked this topic, there is a good number of people, and I was guilty for it way back when, that on their tents specifically, where a lot of people are going to start running into this first and foremost, they don't even use the guylines. And when we say guylines in that instance, it's the ones that hold your rain fly. So let's pretend you know nothing. You put your tent up. Generally, your tent is screened at the top. That way, it'll let air in, keep bugs out, stuff like that. There's a thing called a rain fly. It's basically a big tarp, goes over the whole thing, makes it, mostly waterproof. And a lot of people fail to put on the guy lines because the rain fly will attach by some sort of bungee method or hooks or straps or something, right? It attaches to the poles. And then they see the extra guy lines as just extra stuff. Like, oh, it's still going to be waterproof. Why would I bother putting these out? It's just, there's all those strings in there that are now bugging, getting tangled up and stuff and buggering with other things. And it's just something else I have to set up. And honestly, there is a significant portion of people that will just be like, it's not worth it. But the thing is, it really is worth it, because guylines in that instance, and in a lot of other instances, they do a lot of things. It's not just to keep your rain fly from flapping in the breeze, for lack of a better explanation, because there is, once again, a lot of people that think that that's all it does. It just keeps things secured. It does do that, but that's not the only thing it does. With tents, when you secure your guy lines out, like, that's to give proper ventilation, which is a major thing as a tent camper, wouldn't you say, Ben?
It is. It gets that ventilation, and it'll prevent the condensation. So you hear people often talking about, I bought this tent, I went out, I set it up, and it got wet inside, and part of it is it wasn't properly set up. 100% that. The other thing is, if you get the slightest breeze, it's going to prevent so much of the flapping and wear on the material. It's going to make it feel a bit more claustrophobic without the proper guidelines, for sure. So there's definitely those things. So the purpose of it, you find the same thing on even not the ventilation, but even on your tarps. Without putting them up right, the shelter won't feel like it's maximized, I guess.
And honestly, even with the tarp, yeah, it adds a lot of rigidity. It keeps it from moving around in the wind and stuff, but it'll hold angles. And it does kind of have a little bit to do with ventilation, or more specifically wind shearing, or lack thereof wind shearing. Like, if you can get the specific angles you want, and it'll allow as much air in or keep as much air out as you want. And if you kind of have that sagging in the middle, it's never consistent. And this is what I found when I used hammocks and tarps without an underquilt. Because you may tie your tarp down, assume it's nice and low, the wind picks up a little bit, starts fluffing it, kind of whips under it, and then all of a sudden you got cold butt syndrome. You know what I mean? Or cold feet, or cold back, or whatever the case may be. But that is a very common thing. Once again, with a lot of hammock campers, and it can sometimes be drugged back to just the lack of guy lines.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the importance of using it, that is definitely in there. yeah, but I really kind of wanted to talk about what should you use as a guideline. Every tarp or every tent comes with one. A lot of tarps do, even the hammocks do. Um, and I've seen people replace guidelines with, for example, everyone's absolute favorite paracord, which honestly is an absolute horrible guideline,
Yeah.
in my opinion, right?
And
And some,
for what reasons, Ben? Because once again, we're on the topic. Might as well tell people why not to use this stuff, because paracord kind of became one of those quote unquote golden standards in bushcrafting. Like everybody talks about paracord, but the reality is paracord isn't bad. Don't misunderstand. I'm not knocking paracord, but it may not be that overall 100% utilitarian cordage that everybody makes it out to be. There is a lot of drawbacks to it. So Ben, by all means.
so paracord, when you stretch it out, you'll get everything nice and taut. It'll look absolutely awesome. And you come back 2-3 hours later, and your tarp is going to be sagging. I almost guarantee it, because paracord has this natural stretch to it, and it takes a while for it to actually stretch, and it stretches a long way. You know, you stretch out 10 feet of it, and later on you have like 10 and a half feet. Like it does stretch like that much over time, and when you're setting up a shelter in that's a bad thing, because you want it to be pretty consistent. And there's a couple of tricks we will get to how you can even increase that, even with some of the most ideal materials. Um, and when you get to that, what you're looking for is something that doesn't twist, so it has a cross weave to it, and you want something that has no real stretch to it. And paracord being made up of multiple materials, and that outer jacket, it naturally will stretch, and it kind of that's what allows it to do the things it needs to do. So paracord doesn't have the twist, but it definitely does have that natural stretch. And I find humidity really affects paracord too. So
Yeah.
there's right.
Humidity is a big thing. As one or two things can happen with paracord when it gets wet. Either the knot's going to slip out, or you're never getting it out again. It never seems to be anywhere in between. It either makes it kind of get wet and slide together and bind so hard that once it dries, you almost have to cut that knot out. Or two, depending on the paracord and the outer casing, sometimes they just get slippery and knots don't hold that well.
The other thing with paracord to me is paracord generally is too big for guy line. You don't need it. Like, its max strength is somewhere around 550 pounds. You're not putting 500 pounds on a guy line anyways. And this thing, it's relatively big around. I don't know the exact dimension, but you could probably get 10 of this style stuff that I had in my hands, or even 3 or 4 of these. Look how reflective that is. But because this is thicker than this, but this here is a lot thinner, so it's not taking up the space in your bag. So when you go to put it on your tent, your tarp, your chimney, whatever you're trying to support, it's not taking up any more room or any more weight. And so really you want your guy lines to be set up and neat and tidy, so they're not tangling up and everything. So making them neat and tidy and stuff, that really helps.
So just a couple comments here before we get going too far, because we do have somebody new joining us. And I'm sorry if I kind of butcher this, but it looks like 46 and 2. Hey guys, wow, first time catch the live show. It's 2 a.m. where that fellow's at. I will stream the show tomorrow. Keep up the good work. Greetings from Europe. So hopefully you caught that. Thanks for jumping on the show. Awesome. Especially all the way from Europe there. So Danny joins us from Red Sand Adventures. Once again, shout out to Danny. If anybody hasn't checked out his YouTube channel, it's Red Sand Adventures, as we said. He's doing some really cool stuff over there in PEI with his truck. And then we have Chris Jones, and a couple comments there. I find paracord stretches too much, which we talked about. And the question is, what do you think of using tarred mariner's line, tarred bank line? My uncle always swore by it. I'm going to let you take this one to start.
Tarred bank line, I've rarely used it, but I know I'm fairly familiar with it, and I used bank line, mason line in the past, and it's perfectly fine. It really doesn't have a lot of stretch. The twist in it is minimal, if any, and the tarred stuff gives it a waterproofness, but it also really makes the knots sort of stick. So that kind of helps. It's either a tar or a wax usually on it, and it works quite well. There's nothing wrong with that as an option. Um, I tend to look for something with a bit of reflectiveness in it, and this is because I'm clumsy. So I can see it on my camera, and I'm sure you can. Like, this stuff glows at night. If you got a headlight on or a flashlight, and you're walking by, and you have this on your tent or hanging off your hammock, you will see it for a long ways away. So if you're up for the pee, or if you're coming back from the fire late at night, you're not going to trip over your line. So, yeah, it's definitely a good option. Just be aware that it's not overly visible. There's some easy tricks to fix that. And at least one of them is hanging something like a glow stick or something from ones that you're liable to trip over. The beauty of that is then if you don't want it to be visible, you can quickly flick it off, take it away or whatever. There's a lot of products out there you can use for that.
I agree. Much like Ben, have a good night there, 46 too. Ben is much like Ben. Let me back up. Sorry, two trains of thoughts there. I think Bankline has a proper place. Would I use it for guy lines? Me personally, probably not. For one of the main reasons that Ben mentioned there is that knots tend to bind up pretty tight, especially if you're in hot weather. As the wax or tar or whatever happens to soften up, they can bite onto each other and it becomes dang near impossible to get it out. Secondly, with if it is specifically tarred, once again, you get it warm, set your bag too close to the fire, real hot day, something like that, could get a little residue comes off it. Now, that being said, I always try to have some sort of bank line in my bag. It does a bunch of other stuff really good. Tarred bank line specifically will bind onto itself really hard when you're making shelters or tripods or stuff like that. You put a little wooden toggle in it, twist it a few times, that stuff will bind on amazingly hard and give you a super good hold for a relatively small piece of string. You know what I mean? But yeah, when it comes to guy lines, myself probably wouldn't use it a lot. A little too messy, knots don't come out great, and it's hard to see. Like Ben said, I trip over guy lines all the time, be it my tarp or my tent or whatever. Much like Ben, I always look for something that's reflective, or at least has some reflective properties to it. If it doesn't, I generally stick something on it. Piece of ribbon, flagging tape, we've mentioned in previous podcasts. You know, you should always have a little flagging tape with you, especially if you're going off into the woods where you're not familiar with. That way, if something happens, you can use it as a marker, yada, yada, yada. It also works great for marking your guy lines. A couple little ribbons of that on your guy lines. Hopefully you don't trip over them as easy.
Yeah. The one big thing, like if you do put something that's not easily visible and you trip over it, you can easily damage a tent or a hammock or a tarp. And if you spent a lot of money, I looked at a tarp Sunday. I was in Atmosphere, $300 for a single tarp. And I was a little floored by that. It was just a sil nylon tarp. I think it was a 10 by 10. It was really well folded up, and it had 3 tie-outs per side. So it's 8 tie-outs, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say 3 per side is about the minimum you're looking at, I suppose. Or the minimum you'd want, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, especially if you want like pullouts, and that's what we've seen on a lot of tarps and stuff recently. A lot of them put a pullout in the middle per side. So if you were to fold it in half, and that means when you pull it over in a traditional tent shape, you can pull those 2 pieces out, and that makes the inside feel so much better. Like, it just really gives you all that space, right? Because if you don't, it pulls in on you, and it looks like your sides are in on you. You pull it out, and you're like, wow, I have so much more space. You don't, but you do, right?
It gives you the illusion that you do anyway.
Yeah.
And that's actually a real good point for tarps and hammocks. If you do happen to have like I don't know what they call them. It's not a center tie out, not in the dead center, but it's kind of about, midway up, pullouts, I think is what you call them. Like you said, you can pull that out. Man, it at least gives you enough room that when you're sitting in your hammock, you can get changed. If it's raining or something, the tarp's not right up against you, as most people know. Water these tarps, if it's raining, they're waterproof until you touch them, and you break that water tension, you get that porous, and then water starts just pouring in, stops that from happening. Potentially may help you not get rain in your underquilt, which we experienced in the past. By we, I mean me. So yeah, anyway, so what are some good materials, Ben? We talked about, paracord maybe not being the best. If it's all you have, by all means, don't get me wrong. I'd rather see you have some sort of tie out than have no tie out. But what are some really good ones? You said you had a couple there you liked, but I didn't think you said the name of them. But maybe you did, and I missed it.
I did. I got one of these at Mech and one at Atmosphere. They're both reflective type. You can see the brighter spots on this one, and these are really bright. Like they don't look this bright to me when I'm looking at it, but in the camera it really shows up, and that's what it's like at night when light hits it. So these are proper reflective guidelines. You can buy them on Amazon, any outdoor store. Take a look around for them. I think I got 50 something feet in here and 32 feet here, which really kind of helps. We could probably look a few up later. Those are a good product, and I really tell you that's what I look for, like something relatively small. So I think these were both under 2 millimeters. One was like 1.2, and the other might be 1.8 or something. Mm-hmm. So these diameters are relatively small. They don't take up a lot of room, and so what I tend to do, and I think you do the same, Robert, but I leave a lot of my guy lines tied to my tarps and tents permanently.
Yeah, I do the exact same thing. I tend to roll them up in some sort of speed deploy method. Anybody that's been with me on a camping thing, I've shown them this method. It comes out really nice. And then, you just leave them. And as long as you coil them up nice and small, they really don't tangle up that much.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. Sometimes what I do, because I am lazy, is I will tie press-it knots to them. Just a little loop of string, loop through it 2 or 3 times in a press-it knot style, and then I will hook that to the end, and I'll actually, when I make my coil, I just wrap that thing around a couple of times and hold it in place. And that keeps everything neat and tidy. And when I get there, it's just to undo those extra couple of loops, pull my string out to the right length I want, and then secure it with that press-it knot. That means I don't have to tie any knots when I get out there. Everything's where I expect it to be, and I can set these things up pretty quickly.
Now, on that note, if anybody out there has the guy lines that go onto your tent, hammock, whatever, and they have the little plastic paddles, kind of looks like an oval with 2 holes in either end, those do make your life way easier. The plastic ones, of course, are a little lower quality. You can get them in steel. You can get a couple different things. I think I still might have one of the alien ones here. Maybe not. Oh, yeah, there it is. So you can get a couple different types of these things. They all kind of serve the same purpose, though. When they're on properly, it allows for a speed adjustment of your lines. Another thing I commonly see with new people, and hopefully I'm not talking to anybody too loud because I'm leaning forward talking right into my mic. If I am, I apologize. But I see a lot of people, tent campers, hammock campers, tarps, doesn't matter. They're dangling at the end, and they'll put like slip loops on and stuff like that when they're tying into their bags around the trees. And I'm like, why don't you just use the adjuster? And then, as your tarp or whatever, depending on the quality of your equipment, as it stretches a little bit, like you set it now, and then before you go to bed, you give everything a final adjustment. Everything's nice and taut. No way. People are just like, oh yeah, it's just there. It's in the way more than anything. But yeah, learn to use those things once again for your guy lines. They serve a purpose and they make it way simpler.
You go on Amazon or just Google itself and type in guy line intentioner or adjuster, and they'll come up. Lots of different options. They do work. If you're not confident in your knots or whatever, you want something relatively quick, those are absolutely good methods. And honestly, they can be a saver. Especially you're getting up and it's windy or miserable and you want to quickly adjust it. You don't have to fiddle with something.
So I know you mentioned a couple of your favorite guy line materials, and I those who were watching me see me walk away. I found one that I really like. And I'll give you the reasons why. And I'm going to try and hold this up. There is a product code on it and all that good stuff. I bought it on Amazon. There we go. So as you can see, that's 100% Kevlar braided line, 50 feet of it, 1,000-pound tensile strength.
Wow.
Now I question if it'll actually hold 1,000 pounds, but it'll hold my weight. I put a stick on it, I hung it from my rafters out in the sunroom, and it holds my weight, which is over 300 pounds, and I'm good with that. But it doesn't stretch, and it was dirt cheap. I think I bought that entire 50-foot roll for like $11 on Amazon.
Wow.
So,
Kevlar or Dynamics, the same stuff that makes the am steel. You
yep.
can buy lash it or sling it. That's a product I've used. The only issue I have with that is it's rarely reflective, or at least to the level of this stuff. But I was using that stuff for absolutely everything for the longest time, and I do love it. It's great stuff. It has a similar rating of something 400, 800 pounds or something. It's similar thickness, about 2 millimeters or whatever, 1.8 millimeters, and you can get a ton of it in a very little space. So those are products for sure. I think the one I just sent you was polyester.
Just bringing it up now. All right. So as everybody might have seen, I'm shooting on a new camera here. So if this all goes funky here in a second, I apologize. Well, Ben's not there, but who needs Ben?
Who needs Ben? Can you still hear me?
Oh, I can still hear you fine. You're about to come back up here. You're good.
Yeah. So something like that. I mean, it's dirt simple. It comes with a tensioner. I mean, you can get this stuff 60 feet, 100 feet. The price is all very dependent. Yeah. So 100 feet with some tensioners, $30.
Yeah,
I've spent
that's
more or
not
less.
bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's just an example. I mean, do your research, find out what you really want. When you type up guidelines and stuff, you're going to see a whole bunch of other. Yeah, you can get Gear Aid reflective guideline kit with tensioners, $20.
Just because it's on one heck of a sale right now, not to interrupt our regularly scheduled broadcast, but if anybody was looking for an underquilt, the One Tigress Shield Cradle Double Hammock Underquilt, which is winter rated, it just went on sale for $84.38. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
these are those little round buckley things.
I think they call them alien style, but just different. There are different methods. So yes, get a good tensioner or learn to use like a good press-it knot. The other thing I kind of want to, there's a few other things I'd like to cover. When you're setting up your guidelines, take into consideration the angle, especially with something like a pullout. If you're only a few inches away from the tent, it's really not going to give you the max effect. Yeah, so these are fairly popular in right circles too, right? And they're relatively simple.
Anyway, lots of options out there. Definitely get some auto tensioners. They'll help you out in a big hurry.
So I was saying, when you're tying them out, make sure you consider the angle and stuff. And you will struggle a little bit with that sometimes, because when you get to where the best angle is, maybe the ground isn't the greatest for putting a peg in or something. You sometimes have to sort of think outside of the box a little bit. So I used to carry some titanium tent pegs with me when I go, or some aluminum tri-shaped ones. I have also been known to carry some pretty heavy-duty steel ones if I'm in the right area, that I'm just going to drive into anything and I don't care. Okay, you can push them almost into rock. But I've also been known to tie it around a stick or a rock, and just use the rock as to get the angle I'm looking for.
We've made tent pegs in the woods as well, out of wood.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's usually a pretty good method. Or I've simply tied to a tree or dug up around a root and just pulled it through the edge of the root, and that works amazingly well if you can get away with it.
So
right?
while we're speaking about pegs and guy lines, because another common problem that I have on my list here that a lot of people do, when you're putting your tent pegs in to tie off your guy lines or put down the corners of your tent or anything like that, how do you put them in, Ben? Do you put them straight up and down, or maybe maybe not so much.
Personally, I try to make sure that they're kind of going 90 degrees to the way the string is approaching it. So basically, yeah, that's the way I go. I think a website I was on said it should be at least a 10-degree angle, meaning the tip should be 10 degrees towards your tent or the object you're going. So it needs to definitely be trying to pull it back through the ground. If you pull it straight up, it's more likely to pull it straight out. And if you put it the other way, you're losing all the strength of the peg. Like it's only being held in there by the gravity of the friction of the ground, right? You want to use the weight and the angle of the ground. So it does need to be in a perpendicular angle to the, is that the right word?
Getting all the big words out there now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess for a visual representation, for those of us that are watching on YouTube, if this is your tent and this is your guy line coming down from your tent, see if this makes any kind of sense. You want your pole to be kind of angled like that, back towards the tent. That way when it's pulling up, if this is underground, it has to pull the entirety of the peg up a little bit. And that's kind of the 90 degrees that Ben was talking about. You can shallow it up a little bit. The more you do that, the more it has a tendency to pitch in towards your tent and most likely pull it out of the ground, which is, once again, very common mistake for a lot of people that don't know how to use tent pegs properly, which is nothing to be embarrassed about because no one ever really tells you this stuff. You know what I mean?
That's why we're here to talk about the things.
That's why we pretend to know what we're doing.
But yeah, I mean, the peg angle makes a big difference, and if you get to that angle and you just can't get it there, you can usually vary by a few degrees. Like, you know, I always try to get it like so perfect, but sometimes you just can't. You bring it out to there, and that happens to be the spot where it's the rockiest. Then you can go a couple inches over, and it slides right in as well. That's going to be okay, but try to stick into that degree. And if it gets too far off, then yeah, I mean, I have been known to drag a large log over and wrap it around a log and just use the log and maybe put a couple of rocks to prevent the log from rolling or whatever you need to do, right?
Well, that's just it. And this is one of those few things where horseshoes and hand grenades count. If you can't get it perfect, get as close as you can, and you'll still probably end up way better off than if you don't do them at all. And like I said, I was the guy that I didn't bother putting my guy lines on my tent. They just got in the way. They got tangled up because I never wanted to take time to fold them up. And I was just like, whatever, it's just keeping the rain out. What's the difference? And I always had condensation problems, like habitually. And I was like, oh my gosh, I completely covered this thing in waterproofer like 8 times. This thing should literally be able to be a boat at this point, which probably it could. It shed water great. Problem is, couldn't breathe, couldn't get air in there. So the humidity from your breath, the little bit of moisture that's in the air, whatever, it'll accumulate in your tent. Because generally there's going to be a temperature difference between in your tent and outside. Even though it's very thin material, there's still a temperature difference there. Generally creates condensation. The coldest spot's going to be the walls touching the outside. If you don't go proper ventilation through that, you got a rainfall inside your tent. Super common thing, generally caused by bad ventilation, which usually led back to improper use of guy lines. Either too shallow or, you know, a host of different reasons.
You're literally creating your own microclimate.
Yeah, for lack of a better explanation, that's exactly what you're doing. So guy lines are super important, and that was my main point for all of this was don't shrug them off. I know too many people that just shrug them off as they're not necessary. No, they're not necessary. Like, you will still be somewhat waterproof, but man, they make the difference between staying at like a shady motel in the crack section of town versus going to like a 5-star hotel. You know what I mean? It really does make a massive difference.
Yeah.
So we talked about some do's and don'ts. We talked about some materials. What else should we look for in guy lines, Ben? What do you look for when you're looking for a good guy line? You did mention diameter. We did mention a little bit of reflectiveness. But is there anything else you look for?
Something that's going to be somewhat durable. Obviously, but it's surprising how little strength. Like I said, I've used mason line before. Gone to the dollar store. I think for $1 you get like 200 feet or something, and one roll tends to last me for a long time. So that works, and you can get bright orange, bright yellow. It's not reflected, like day glow, or not night glow, like with the reflective stuff, but it's a lot better than nothing. So yeah, I look for things that are going to sort of stand out that I'll be able to see at night. That's relatively strong or cheap enough that if I'm going to have to throw it away after a few trips, I don't mind it. But if you spend the extra few bucks for maybe a more quality brand, you'll use it for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, almost any rope could be used as a guideline, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a great guideline. So again, just something that's no real twist, no real stretch, lightweight, small diameter. You don't need to put 500 pounds on it. If you're not going to use the tensioners and you're not going to use like the press-it knot, there are different knots that you could learn. And I think I sent you a little link. We could talk about that. We don't have to look up guideline and knots, and there's some pretty standard with trucker hitch and stuff like that to get
And
your.
we've talked about this once again in the past before. There's the knots. There's only a handful of real basic knots that you need to learn for most of bushcrafting. Not saying that there isn't a ton that you can draw from that will do things better, don't get me wrong. But there's like 5 basic knots that'll cover most of what you're going to do. And there are different versions of loops and bites and things like that. So getting to know a couple basic ones, a press-it knot's a great one because it gives you the adjustability. A trucker's hitch because you can cinch stuff down. A bowl one, it's a great way to tie things off. A figure 8, you can either on a bite or not on a bite, whichever. Actually, figure 8 and a bite, I guess, more what I'm thinking because it'd be used for holding stuff up. I'll use a figure 8 and a bite around a piece of rope. Put that around a tree, put a wooden toggle through the bite. You can put your kit bag up. Like, there's a couple basic things you can learn. That'll do the majority of everything you're going to do out there. Including guidelines. And I'm trying to get that link up here, Ben. Just give me 2 seconds, buddy.
Just something you can do. I've seen people use a stick and just twist the stick around a couple of times and then put a loop on it to hold it in place, just to create tension where they needed to worry about it. All these are methods that are doable. I wouldn't stress about any of them. But yeah, so I think we've covered a lot of it. Like I said,
here's that website for the knots for you.
Tautline hitch is actually one I've rarely used. I don't even remember the name of the one I normally use. It's basically you make a loop that would disappear when you put tension on it and just run the string through. Yeah, slip knot. And or I think they might call it the trucker's hitch.
Could be. But netknots.com, I do know this website. It's good. It has the animated knots, as you can see there. So it's definitely a good one to check out. There's another, if you Google animated knot tying, there's another website that does it very well too. And you can learn a lot of cool things to use on your guy lines and ridge lines and everything else in between.
Yeah, so the trucker's hitch is what I'll often use if I'm down to it. Tie the knot. So you got a little loop hanging out, run your string through it, tie it down, put an extra loop to hold it in place. And then when you're ready to go, you just pull it. Just a couple of yanks and the whole thing disappears.
Yeah, and that's what I use a lot too, to be perfectly honest with you. Even when I'm strapping stuff down to my truck, I use versions of a bowline with a trucker's hitch and then a quick release knot, and that's basically all I use everywhere. Unless I'm setting up like a lean-to style tarp, and then I'll use a press-it knot or something like that, right? That way I can pull it out and get the adjustability I really want from it.
So, a couple of very basic knots, a decent rope that's going to do your job. Make sure you got your angles good. We both agree that if you leave it to your tarp and tie it up, clean it up, every time you go to put it away, tie it, bundle them up nice and neat and tidy. I've carried, because I have daughters, little elastics, hair elastics.
Yep.
And sometimes just throw a couple of those over them to keep them neat and tidy. Because if you just take your tarp with a whole bunch of loose rind and throw in a bag, when you take it out, you're going to be working for about an hour to straighten it all out again. So take the 10, 15 minutes it takes to put your tarp away properly and dry. And bundle up your guide lines, and you'll be really happy because when you take it out, everything's ready to go, and it makes things really good. I do the same thing with my tents, my hammocks, anything I have to have guide lines on them. I take a few minutes when I'm putting them away to make sure everything's dry and the strings are all tidied up. Because if you don't, the strings get tied up and knotted, and the only thing you're going to want to do is cut them all off and start again. So, tensioners or adjusters, we agree are a good thing.
Yep.
But a good press-it knot is also great. Knowing how to use a trucker's knot, or any type of tensioning knot, would be a good skill to pick up on. But yeah.
So I was literally trying it here before I made a complete ass of myself. But a good way of stowing the lines that I use, I don't use the method like Ben there with elastics and stuff. I use, like I said, a fast deploy kind of roll, which is just the palm of your hand and literally figure 8 around your thumb and your pinky finger. So it makes that kind of nice figure 8 like that, and then you can do just pinch the middle, do your typical tie off however you want. But the beauty of this is when you grab the end that was in the middle, it'll just completely pay out, doesn't tangle, doesn't twist. And then you can just run that to wherever you have to go. Like different methods, different strokes, different folks, right?
I loop it the same way. I just use a quick elastic because I have hundreds of them.
I don't have so many of them. You have a few more females in your vicinity than I do, my good sir.
It's a blessing and a curse, my friend.
But yeah. I'm trying to think. I kind of covered all the points I wanted to hit on guy lines. So where do you want to go from here, Ben? We're only at 36 minutes.
Well, we always aim to doing a few shorter ones, but yeah, we don't have to spend a ton of time on this. But it was a subject that I thought was worth some people listening to. What do we think is good? A good sturdy rope. I really do like the reflective stuff, and it saves your gear. Tying down, using your tie points, you kind of pointed out, it saves it helps the tent work properly, but it also prevents wear and tear, because if that thing's left loose, flapping material shortens the lifespan of any of your gear and stuff, right? Probably as much or more as over tightening.
Not only will it hurt the tarp, it can hurt your tie-out points. It'll beat grommets out of tarps. It'll take the stitching at a tie-out point. So if you can keep those not snapping tight, you don't want to try and rip them off the tarp. But if you can keep them taut, a good constant pressure on them, it extends the life, much like Ben said.
So I did forget one thing I wanted to talk about, and automatic tensioners.
Okay.
And so, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I've done it. It's sort of like a bungee cord. You can get a bungee cord to hook onto the end, where you can just use the elastic in it, but you can also get the tubing, vinyl tubing, like really stretchy tubing, like you find in some exercise gear. Cut about 6-7 inches of that, run your line through it, tying it off on either end so that there's a loose amount inside, and when you tension it so it's about half stretched,
and then it'll just keep constant pressure.
Yeah, it'll keep a constant pressure, and then if it gets under a large load, it'll stretch out, but the end of the rope will stop it from snapping that elastic. But then when the strain is gone, it'll pull it back to the same tension you had it at before. So some kind of elastic device that you can attach to it, doesn't have to be all that long, will help with quick snaps. And it's really good if you accidentally step on your line or trip over, or if a ridiculous big wind comes, because what it prevents it from doing is that snapping. Is when it hits, it's just going to drag on and then drag off a little bit. So that natural amount. A good tensioner sort of does a similar job as if it's an overly large force, the tensioner will release. And then when the pressure comes off, it'll be loose, but at least will prevent a tearing or destruction, right?
Yeah, and I've actually broken a few guy lines by tripping over them. Never tried the tube method like you're just saying there, the sports tube or whatever, but that probably would have solved the problem. In all honesty, once again, come out of my tent, go to pee, do whatever in the middle of the night, and you just don't look down, not thinking, come out of your hammock. It's easy to do. You think you step over it as the worst case, and then you don't. You actually just hook the whole thing while you're trying to step over it, which is pretty common too. And yeah, you either end up tripping or potentially ripping the tarp or the grommet or the tie out or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I've seen it done somewhere. And I'm just kind of looking. See if I can. Shock cord, silicone rubber guideline tensioner, shock cords, rubber band trap lines.
Little different avenue here, but we used to use that for slings for rifles.
Yes.
Not like hunting rifles, but like in CQB, close quarter combat, something like that. If you had to, going down a completely different rabbit hole here, depending on what your setup was, if you had a smaller whatever, you could usually drop that to go for your secondary, and the shock cord would allow it to drop, swing to the side, and then kind of come back up under your arm. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Same kind of deal.
The rubber off slingshots works really good for the same thing. There's a few places you can get that, but yeah, that is a method I've seen done. I've tried it a few times. It really does work good. I don't tend to stick to it because it adds weight and bulk that I just didn't want to deal with at the time. But yeah, there's some things to think about. So, next time you're out, make sure that you got good guidelines. See what the difference is. You're really going to enjoy it. It's going to make your trip more enjoyable. Tie them up at the end. Simple topic, but I think it's a topic worth talking about.
Definitely a topic worth talking about because it's so easily overlooked. Even seasoned people will overlook the importance of putting guidelines out. And I know, sounding like a broken record over here, you're like, oh, put your guidelines out. It really is important, folks.
If we were to continue, I would just throw out the next best thing is to sort of take some thought about what you're going to use to tie them to. And I think I kind of mentioned it. There's all kinds of tent pegs and peg systems out there. I've often used some lightweight aluminum or titanium ones. The lightweight ones tend to bend and can't take the load as well. So if you're in harder, rockier ground, you may want to look at a proper steel one. If you have the right tree type, then quickly, you can quickly whittle one down out of a couple of saplings. And that's pretty well my favorite. A couple of alder saplings will usually make enough tent pegs for a trip. You may even have enough material left over to make a couple of weenie roasty sticks.
And I'm a big... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So the beauty of those is they're biodegradable. Just let the string go and leave them. They may even grow afterwards.
I'm a big believer in making your own tent pegs or don't spend a lot. I mean, there's two different trains of thought on here. As Ben mentioned, he's got a real good set there. I'm the other mindset on this. I just go to the dollar store, buy what they have. I try to avoid the plastic ones. I'm not a fan of the plastic ones. That's my personal opinion. Don't hark on anyone that does like them. I don't care for them. I just buy the cheap old, number 7 aluminum ones, steel ones if I happen to get them, and just take a handful of them. And if I bend one around, I just go, throw it in the garbage bag and put another one in.
Yeah. So, yeah, getting good pegs and understanding how to use them. There are different types. There are winter ones. There are sand ones. Sand ones are bigger and flatter. And so when you drive them in, it's the weight of the sand that holds them in, not the friction of the sand. And when it comes time to pull most tent pegs out, there are some tools you can get for it. But the reality is a lot of them have a loop with a string, and I just grab it with my finger or put a stick through it and pull them right through. A properly installed tent peg will pull out, straight out rather easily, unless you're pushing it through some pretty dense material, like trees or rocks. If they can get jammed in around a rock, and that's what's going to bend and damage your tent peg.
And I guess that's my last hint. I try to avoid hammering a tent peg in. I try to do it under my own weight. Once again, bigger guy, I have that advantage just to kind of step on it, push it in one smooth motion. If it hits something it doesn't like, you get that feedback and you can kind of readjust. I find when you're hammering it in, especially if it's an improvised hammer of some sort, you grab a piece of firewood, whatever the case may be, you could be hammering this thing and not even noticing it's just kind of like seeing around underground. Then the first time you get a little bit of wind, rips the whole thing out of the ground, and now it's beating against your tent or inside your hammock or just flying around in the wind all willy-nilly. So, once again, my 2 cents, my hint, so to say, is try to avoid hammering them in if you can. Now, there is some situations where you have to. I understand that. It's just, as a best practice for me, I try not to.
That's the beauty of the saplings. With the sapling, if you do have to hammer it in, they're flexible enough they sometimes just
bounce right back out.
And you really don't worry about pulling them back out. Like, you really do not have to pull those out. If you're worried that someone could trip or hurt himself over them, either cut it flush to the ground or hammer it the rest of the way in when you're done. Yeah, I think that covers it. I think
and much like Red Bear said, his line of thinking, and I'm sure you're the same, Ben, a nice tight guy line, because the flapping or fluttering of a tent or tarp in the night, in the wind, will wake you up constantly.
Oh, man, will it ever drive you nuts?
And if for some reason, halfway through the night, one of your guy lines comes loose or comes detached, don't say, I'll get it in the morning. Because you're not going to sleep. You will not sleep that night. Take the couple seconds, hop out of your hammock, hop out of your sleeping bag, do whatever, go readjust it, then crawl back in and get some good solid sleep. Because otherwise you will not sleep. Because I can guarantee you, if it's a hammock, because I've had this happen, it will find its way up under there and whip you in the face constantly.
If it lets go at the tent peg, the things can actually just flip around. They will smash into the tent. They will flick things. They're just a freaking hazard, right?
Well, yeah.
So 100% that is an issue or a concern. Yeah. So that's
go to places any to end it for tonight. We made the 45-minute mark, and for Guylines, I think that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. For Guylines. Yeah. So, I don't know what we're going to talk about next week at the moment, but I'm sure we have a few dozen good ideas. But that was our topic for this week. Guylines, take a look at yours. Make sure they're in good shape.
Replace them if they're getting frayed. A lot of people push them way too long.
Yeah. There's nothing worse than losing your guideline when you're out. Well, there's a lot of things worse. Not much worse, though, when you're setting it up and your guidelines are frayed and you kind of know it, and then it breaks in the middle of the night. That is a miserable time.
Nothing more annoying than a broken guideline you can't fix.
Yeah.
As always, thanks to everybody that joined us here tonight. Chris Jones, Danny from Red Sand Adventures, Red Bear Tactical joined us there, and our new friend, 46-2, or 46-2. Once again, folks, thanks for joining us from all corners of the globe, and hopefully we'll see you all again next week. Night, everybody.
Night up.